So let's go back to that. So I found this response very interesting because obviously the folds are self-evident. They are complete misses on this flop. The calls are somewhat self-evident too. They tend to be the hands that have got some equity. You know, we're calling with a hand like ace-10 suited because, as we said before, nobody really hits this flop most of the time. So the pre-flop ranges remain true, and you know, ace-10 suited is still a relatively strong hand, even though it's just ace high.
Yeah, it's actually going to usually be ahead.
Yeah, and but I think the particularly interesting thing about this range is the check raises. So if we look at the let's simplify this again to oh no, we were already simplifying, my apologies. But if we look at the raises here, so these are the hands that chose to check raise on this board, this board that's difficult to hit most of the time. Now, hands with a 4 in it check raise for obvious reasons. It's for value, and because we said that, you know, the under the gun raiser has a lot of strong hands pre-flop, you'd expect them to continue to a check raise, so you'd get some value with your 4, which is why for a 4,
there's a difference here between being in position and out of position as the defender. Let's say we've called in position and we've got this flop and we're sitting there with ace-4 suited, and the pre-flop aggressor starts betting into us. That's a spot where you will do a lot of calling because you basically want him to keep betting, and if he does, you can raise on a later street and try and get the stacks in. But when you're out of position, you're much more incentivized to check raise with your really strong hands, because if you check call, the next street might go check check, and that's obviously a disaster. So when you're sitting there with a 4, you really want to get all the money in, and the best way to do that is to check raise the flop. If he goes with the hand, we can get in on the flop. If he just calls, now we have the betting lead, and it'll be perfectly natural for us to lead into him on the turn as well, and give him another decision. If he calls again, then we can shove the river. So the way this range is constructed is kind of built around 2 things. Our 4s definitely want to raise for value. It's the best way to try and get the money in by the river. Our 7s often want to raise as well, because while they'll be the best hand right now most of the time, they're extremely vulnerable. Remember, the under the guns opening range has lots of overcard type hands, you know, king queen type hands that have 6 clean outs against our 7. So our 7s usually want to raise as well. They're raising less for value, more for equity denial. And that's obviously where the value part of our range comes from, in addition to the few overpairs that we have, 9s, 8s, and a bit of 10s. So once we've decided our value range, then we now have to decide, okay, what hands are we going to use as bluffs?
And this is a bit I find quite interesting, because I think most people who will be watching this know that drawing hands make good bluffs, because obviously if you get called, and then you've got the opportunity to make a big hand on the turn of the river and get value with it instead. There's not that many obvious draws on this board. So we've got 6-5. We have all the combinations of 6-5. We've got 5-3 as well. 8-6. All these hands could make a straight on the turn. But we also have stuff like 10-9, Jack-10. And I'll hand over to you, Dara. Why do these hands make good check raise bluffs when they seemingly are nothing on this board?
Okay, if we look at a hand like Jack-10 suited, so if you look at Jack-10 suited, if you look over here, you'll see that that's probably the best view there. Yeah, you can see that for each combination, it shows you what it does. The red are the check raises, and the greens are the check calls, and the blues are the check folds. You can see that Jack-10 of clubs is actually just pretty much being check folded. That's because it doesn't have a backdoor flush draw. The ones that have the backdoor flush draw all want to continue. Now, they don't have super strong equity, so they're probably not much better than break-even calls. And when you have a hand that isn't really making much as a call, that's often turned into a bluff as the if it wants to continue, because remember, when you raise, you're adding fold equity. You still have the equity of your hand. You know, Jack-10 can make a straight by the river if it comes specifically 8-9. If it hits the Jack or the 10, it's going to pull ahead a lot of the time as well. And if it hits one of its suit, it's going to turn a flush draw and can maybe make a flush by the river. So what a hand like Jack 10 suited can do is it's pretty weak right now. It's basically Jack high with just backdoors. But so if we check raise it and add fold equity, in other words, the opportunity for our opponent to fold, that makes the play profitable. But even if it's called, it still has the chance to make a really strong hand by the river. For example, if let's say we raise the Jack 10 of diamonds, then if an 8 or a 9 comes, we turn a flush, or we turn a gut shot, basically. If we hit the Jack or the 10, we actually have a hand which we can probably take to try and get to showdown fairly cheaply and win a lot of the time. And if we had hit a diamond, we turn a flush draw, so we can bet again as a bluff. So that kind of hand is very versatile. Lots of things can happen. We can just get a really bad turn card and give up. We can hit a turn card which gives us a draw and bet again as a bluff, and then it can maybe hit the river and be a really strong hand, either a straight or a flush, and we can bet it for value. Or if we miss, we can potentially think about turning it into a bluff. Remember, on every street you need to have bluffs and value hands, and the great advantage of a hand like Jack 10 suited is it can turn into either on a later street. If it turns, for example, a diamond and misses the river, it's potentially a very good bluff. It's just Jack high. But if it hits diamond or 8-9, it's going to be a value bet on the river. So that's why we're using those hands basically on the flop.
And I just want to point out something I find very useful with GTO Wizard and some of the other solvers out there as well. I'm a recreational player, and I'd say my biggest personal leak at the moment is just retaining all this information. So I sometimes look at particularly when it's a wide range, like a big blind defending range, I struggle to keep all these different hands in my head sometimes when I'm thinking about these things at the table. So you actually have a really good feature here which summarizes the type of hand and what they do. So for example, top left, quads, red, it always raises. There's only one type of quads that we can have here. The full houses, interestingly, they elect to raise some of the time and call some of the time. That kind of makes sense, because a full house, you probably don't want to scare people off. Trips will raise a little bit more because obviously that's a slightly more vulnerable hand against, say, a pocket pair. Over pairs here, you can see what they do. They'll raise more. Top pair, as you mentioned, they want to get it in. Then you can boil this down to like under pairs and third pair. They mostly call. That makes sense as well. You kind of got a bluff catcher of a hand. Ace high, there's a mix because, as we mentioned, ace high is sometimes good here. It's sometimes worth a call. Sometimes you want to get rid of it. But it also categorizes the hands in terms of what type of draw they've got. So we've got an open-ended straight draw. There's only one of those, 6-5 that we've mentioned. Gut shots, we've got 8-5, 8-6, 6-3, and 5-3. Backdoor flush draw 2 cards. This is the hand that Dara was talking about. Say Jack 10 suited can make a straight or a flush. And then no draw, it's the absolute airball hands. And we're I don't even know which ones we're bluffing there. But yes, I find this, and it even judges the hands in terms of, strong hands, quite good hands, weak hands are complete trash.
Yeah.
So for someone who has a kind of a working memory issue and sometimes struggles to keep all these hands in their head at the same time, spinning plates, I find this very, very useful. It kind of I think they call it buckets. They're, bucketing the hands together.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you can see there on that view, it tells you how much in each bucket you have. Like on this flop, the big blind doesn't have actually too many of the best hands. I think they're classified as anything that have more than 75% equity. So only 6.3% of the time do we have one of the best hands. We have a good hand 19.6% of the time, and we have a weak hand or complete trash, which is less than 25%. Quite a lot of the time. In terms of which hands to check raise and which hands to check call, I talked about check raising certain hands for value, and that kind of makes sense. Like most of our 4s want to raise, most of our 7s want to raise, and our overpairs. But we have to call some of these hands as well, because you can't fall into the mistake of check raising all your strong hands, because then when you do that, then your check call range just becomes weak hands that are trying to get to showdown as cheaply as possible. And if you're that type of player, good players will pick up on that and they'll exploit you by overbetting the next street and putting you in a horrible spot. So you have to hold back some hands. So you can see, for example, ace four suited is actually being called most of the time. And in terms of the hands that we do raise as opposed to call, there is a general principle as well, which is built around the idea of blockers. When we're blocking his really strong hands, we're more likely to call ourselves. And when we're not blocking them, we're more likely to raise. So you can see, for example, quads actually goes, the reason why quads raises more than a full house is when we have quads. Okay, he doesn't have a four, but you know, he didn't start with too many fours anyway, and there are two of them on the board. But he can have all the overpairs still. We're not blocking those hands, and we're not blocking his 7x as well. We're not blocking 7-6 suited, 8-7 suited, or ace-7 suited. So he has quite a decent amount of hands that will actually be able to pay off our check raise. Our full houses, well, actually, the only full house on this board is going to be, well, actually, sorry, no, there's a couple of full houses, pocket sevens or 7-4 suited specifically. Again, when we have those hands, now we're actually blocking quite heavily his strong hands. Because if we have pocket sevens, there's only 1 7 missing that he can have. If we have, whereas when we have pocket fours, there's 3 7s he can have. So he has 3 times as many combinations of all those. And that's why you can see that the full house is actually doing less raising than quads. Similarly, you can see that the overpairs raise less than top pair, or raise more, sorry, because when we have the overpair, he'll have the 7 more often. But when we have the 7 ourselves for top pair, he's going to have the 7 a little bit less often. So that's why we construct the range. And the same similarly applies to draw as well. I won't go into that now in detail, but typically the draws we want to raise when we're raising, we prioritize very strong draws, which you can see why the open-ended straight draws are raising more often than just the gut shots. And actually the backdoor flush draw, hands are also raising quite a lot. This is kind of like you raise your really strong draw because if he raises again, you can continue, and you raise your really weak draw, which is just a backdoor flush draw, because if he raises, you can just fold. But a gut shot, it would kind of suck to raise that and get 3-bet. So that's why that calls more often.
Yeah, you'd be very, very happy to have that hand checked through and then hit it on the turn when you had very little equity on the flop in the first place.
Yeah, and if we look at the equity buckets, like this all kind of makes sense. Obviously, with our best hands, we're never folding. We're either raising or calling, and we're mostly raising because these are our best hands, so we're trying to maximize our value. Remember, we're out of position, so if we just check call and the turn goes check check, that's kind of a disaster. It's going to, the pot's that much smaller. So with our best hands, we are trying to get all in by the river. So we're mostly check raising, but as I said, we can't always check raise, because if you always check raise your best hands, then when you check call, an observant opponent will pick up on the fact that you can't have a really strong hand. Our good hands are now mixing. They're actually calling more often than they're raising, because probably the best way to get more money into the pot from hands that are worse than ours, when we only have a good hand, not a great hand, is to check call. With our weak hands, we're actually starting to mix all 3 things now. We're folding some of them. That'll be the weakest hands in that bucket. We're raising some of them. That will also be the weakest hands in those in that bucket. Hands that don't play great as a call, but typically have some sort of blocker as well, or a double backdoor hand. You can see, for example, 5-3 suited is there. And then our trash hands, well, they're obviously mostly just folding, but we will occasionally turn them into raises as well as bluffs, and we will occasionally call them. And again, the main reason we're only occasionally calling them is for board coverage. We want to have some hands that can kind of hit an unexpected hand by the river. But again, the raising frequency and the calling frequency are quite low. So in practice, you could probably just simplify to always folding your trash. Okay, so if you enjoyed the topic that we went into today, I suggest two things. First of all, you buy our latest book where we go into the whole GTO poker approach in detail. But I also suggest you get GTO Wizard. There is a free trial version you can play around with yourself to see if it's for you. It's obviously not for everyone, but as I said, I use it as my main study tool. If you do decide to buy it, if you use the URL on screen, you get a 10% discount.